In 1984, Frank Hyman was a delegate to the South Carolina State Democratic Convention and helped deliver his state to Jesse Jackson's presidential program. Not long after he moved to Durham, he says, because the summers are cooler here, Frank never wanted a career. Instead, he makes his living from the 9 professions he's mastered: stonemasonry, carpentry, horticulture, design, photography, sculpture, foraging, politics, and writing. He's held 2 local elected offices: Conservation District Supervisor and Durham City Council member, where he authored the first living wage ordinance in the South. His ancestors served in the Confederate States Army, and his essay, "The Confederacy Was a Con Job on White People and Still Is," has appeared in more than a dozen large newspapers. He's also a policy analyst for Blue Collar Comeback, which is the name of the website where you'll find links to that and his other essays that have appeared in print. Please help me welcome Mr. Frank Hyman.
Turn it off. Great, thank you. Welcome, glad to see everybody. And so today I'm talking about the Neo-Confederates, the people flying the rebel battle flag and trying to keep all the Confederate memorials in place, how the Neo-Confederates don't know their history. And there are lots of places I could start in this discussion, but I think what I want to address first is recognizing that there's at least one person here who's wondering, why is that guy wearing out-of-date clothes, and what is with the red threads? So let me answer that first. So we're doing a little bit of a Civil War reenactment here. And I am representing Dr. John Lewis Johnson of Forsyth County, who was studied medicine in North Carolina. And perhaps one day I'll do some battle reenactment, I'll set up a little shop and I'll be the doctor there with a sign that says free surgery. You know, I'll have leeches. I think with my knowledge of medicinal herbs and my collection of rusty power saws in the truck, I'm qualified to be a surgeon of the 1860s. So Dr. Lewis Johnson was essentially drafted into the Confederate States Army in 1861, and it's reported that at the Battle of Sharpsburg, he was captured under suspicious circumstances, which I interpret meaning he's kind of like, yeah, I'm surrendering, y'all, come get me. And so, but they paroled him, which is a term for, in those days, the armies didn't always want to keep all the prisoners they had, so they would happily either swap them or have you sign on your honor that you would not rejoin the military and they would let you go home. So he was paroled to go home to North Carolina, where he then joined an organization, or essentially helped start an organization in 1861 called the Heroes of America, or HOA was the acronym. And it was essentially the resistance to the Confederacy. By the end of the war, there were over 10,000 people just in North Carolina alone who were members of the Heroes of America. They were also active in other states, Virginia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and there were comparable organizations in all the other southern states, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But the red string was their signal to each other. They would sew a red thread into their lapel, so it would be not very noticeable, or they'd put some red thread in a window. So when a runaway slave or a deserter or some other unionist came by, they would know, oh, these people will help me. And so that's what the red string is about. So that's where we are. Did everybody get a handout? No. So yeah, can we pass those out? And so you don't really need the handout to go along with this. It just has my website, several books that I've drawn from, but not all of the books, and a couple of websites. The ones at the bottom will give you more details on the red strings, the Heroes of America, and I'll be talking a little bit about them later. The 4 books that I reference here are that would give you a lot of background on things that aren't taught in schools or even in colleges here. Let me just ask, who here went to school in North Carolina, either high school or college? Had you ever heard of the Red Strings? And if you've heard of it, raise your hand. Like, nobody. Okay, who was living in North Carolina during the recent celebration of the sesquicentennial, the 150th years of the Civil War? Who was living in North Carolina from 2011 to 2015? Right? And you didn't hear about the Red Strings or how there was resistance to the Confederacy all over North Carolina. Right? Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. And so one of my themes is that our history teachers and our history professors have really let us down. And I don't mean that they are bad people. They are not bad people. They are nice people and they work hard. Somehow they totally missed all of this. And I don't mean totally like 100%, but I mean like 95% of them, because there is no lack of documentation about any of these things I'm going to share with you. These 4 books, From Slavery to Freedom by John Hope Franklin, who I was fortunate enough to meet before he died, because we both had an interest in plants. Made him give me a tour of his greenhouse of his orchids. But his book, From Slavery to Freedom, shows that, contrary to what most people would believe, that the enslaved Africans were just kind of passive through this whole war. He's like, oh no, they were like undermining it from the inside. So that's a good book for exploring that aspect of the Confederacy. The State of Jones. Did anybody here see the movie Free State of Jones? Yeah, right. Had you heard anything that like chunks of the South were taken away from the Confederacy by Southerners? No, that was never in school. The next book, South versus South, he basically makes the case that while there was a civil war between the North and the South, within the South, there was a civil war. And I'll give you some details on that. The last book I mentioned here, White Trash, the 400-year untold history of class in America. So these are my people. My family, we spent the first 3 years of my life living in a trailer park, and a lot of the people I grew up with still live in a trailer park. And so I'm allowed to say white trash or trailer trash, but you're not, okay? So that particular book only has 1 chapter on the Civil War, but it summarizes a lot of what's in these other books. And the important thing is and some or all of these may be in the Durham County Library. I would expect the White Trash book is, and I might suggest starting there, because you can just like tackle 1 chapter and get a lot of this, and then you can go forward and back in time and looking at the history of class in America. But also because her notes on that chapter are very extensive. She references like about a dozen books on the topic of resistance in the South and how, a lot of things the Neo-Confederates are telling us just aren't true, as well as like several dozen papers that have been published. So there's really no excuse for a history teacher or a history professor not to be telling you, okay, here's the broad outline of the Civil War, and did you know there were the Red Strings? That you may have ancestors from North Carolina or other southern states, and they may or may not have been in the Confederate States Army, but they might have been fighting the Confederate States Army on the side of the Union in the South, both black and white. So, so share that with with anybody you know who's into history. And the last thing I'll mention is that on that score is that I just read an article recently about some folks. Southerners on New Ground, have you heard of them? So to their credit, to their credit, a bunch of them went to Hillsborough a month or 2 ago when there were, I think, like 500 Neo-Confederates waving the battle flag showed up. And to their credit, the Southerners on New Ground, which is SONG is their acronym, weren't like all like screaming at them and calling them trailer trash like some of the other foolish, I think, counter-protesters were doing. They instead went to people one-on-one to ask them, so why are you here? What's the flag mean to you? When you say heritage, not hate, what's the heritage you mean? They had the wisdom to shut up and listen. And one of these people said that they took an advanced placement history class, one of the SONG people, where near Charlotte, and the history professor, the teacher there was telling them that Civil War wasn't about slavery. Yeah. Right. So it's not my imagination, but going back to the SONG people asking these folks, and this illustrates an important point I want to make today. that I'm sure a lot of them thought, oh, we'll go and talk to these people and we'll persuade them. We'll bring them to our side. And I'm kind of like, nah, 90-some%, just, it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what you do. They believe this strange thing that the war was not about slavery and the South was, all these brave Southerners were defending our homeland, et cetera, et cetera. And the point I want to make there is that always and only in politics, there's always three groups of people. I don't have something to draw it on here. There's always going to be a group that when they see a talk, Neo-Confederates don't know their history. There's going to be a group that's like, they don't even know anymore. They're just going to go, yes. I'm going to call them the yes group. I don't even explain anymore. They're just on board, right? Think of any issue, abortion, taxes, blah, blah, blah. There's some people automatically, yes, they're with you without any explanation. On the other end, there's the people, no, they're against that. They hear about this, they're like, oh no, this guy Frank Hyman, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's wrong. No matter what I say, they're going to think I'm wrong, so that's the no group. And then there's the group in the middle, the maybes, who are really not following this stuff very closely, right? And they could fall out on either side, depending on how they're approached, on what they hear, on what they see. And so in my talk here, I'm really not aimed at the yes people. I'm really not aimed at the no people. I'm aimed at the maybes. And what's important about that is to recognize that if you're in some discussion with one of these protesters waving the rebel flag, and you tell them, oh, Frank Hyman said it was about slavery because of da-da-da-da-da, and they don't believe you, that should not discourage you. That should just confirm what I'm telling you. Some people do not want to hear this, and you will be wasting your time arguing with them. You'll be wasting your time debating with them. As soon as you recognize you're dealing with somebody who's in the no group, wish them well and let them go, and go find somebody who's in the maybe group, who's willing to listen, who's not really sure, who kind of thinks, yeah, I grew up in a racist culture. I don't have any black friends. I'm worried, when the guy's walking and his pants are hanging low, I worry. That's the maybe person who can be persuaded. So that's what this is aimed at. If this is any help to you, don't spend your time talking to the no group. Don't try to persuade the yes group because they're on board. Look for the maybes, okay? So, right, so there's two main points. So now I'm going to get to the heart of the discussion. So there's two main things the Neo-Confederates can be found saying a lot, and I'm sure you've heard this, that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about tariffs. And on and on. So I'm going to talk about that some. The second thing they make is the point they make, or the conventional wisdom that most of us grew up with or learned, was that the South was united in fighting the North. And that's a bunch of mess too, and I'm going to address that. The third point I'm going to make at the end of our discussion is one you may not have heard before. But I want to make the point, I think I'm going to help you understand that the economic inequality within the southern states allowed the 1%ers of that time, who were the plantation class, literally the 1%, it allowed them to rule as a tyranny of the minority. You've all heard, in civic class, you heard about the tyranny of the majority and what a terrible thing that would be, right? But they were able to manufacture a tyranny of the minority at that time. And this is relevant to today because the economic inequality we suffer from now has created, truthfully, a new tyranny of the minority. And I'm going to help you understand how that is structured and how it can be dismantled. And the political institutions that helped create that tyranny of the minority that we had then and that we still have now are the real slavery era monuments that we should be focused on tearing down. Lovely as it might feel to pull down a hollow piece of bronze, it's kind of like nobody's life got better anywhere. My sentiments are with the folks who want to tear them down. My experience and my practice tells me the thing to do is put them in a museum or a warehouse or something, and to put all that energy into these institutions I'm going to tell you about at the end, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read to you. So this is the essay, has anybody, Jenny referred to, the Confederacy was a con job on white people and still is. Has anybody read that? There's about a third of the people here, so bear with me. Don't check your phones while I'm reading this. It'll only take 5 minutes, and the people that haven't heard it, and you as well, I think will realize it kind of sets up the rest of the discussion, okay? So this is a essay that I wrote back when Dylan Roof had shot all those people in the church. And that created the energy for bringing down the Confederate flag in South Carolina, Capitol, and other places. And one of my concerns was that people were seeing the Confederate flag and the Confederacy and all this as merely, bad as it is, but merely being a bad thing for black people, which it is. But in my growing up and research, I realized, wow, the Confederacy and all this stuff was really bad for white people, and nobody's talking about this. Because a lot of the no people and a lot of the maybe people really aren't concerned that the Confederacy or other things were bad for black people. That's kind of what it means to be a racist. Things that are bad for black people, they kind of don't care. And I'm willing to acknowledge that's where they are. But I still want to bring them onto our side of the barricade. And the way to do that is to address their concern about the effects of all this stuff on white people. So that's what this essay was about. It ran in most of the capitals of the Confederacy, the Richmond paper, the Atlanta paper, the Austin paper, I'm forgetting a few, the Florida paper, and half a dozen others. So read by probably, if everybody who got the paper read this essay, it's like over 1 million people read it. I received not a dime, but, I still think I did a good job there. So here we go. Confederacy was a con job on whites and still is. I've lived 55 years in the South, and I grew up liking the Confederate flag. I haven't flown one for many decades, but for a reason that might surprise you. I know the South well. We lived wherever the Marine Corps stationed my father, Georgia, Virginia, the Carolinas. As a child, my favorite uncle wasn't in the military, but he did pack a .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun in the trunk of his car. He was a leader in the Ku Klux Klan. Despite my role models, as a kid, I was an inept racist. I did get in trouble once in the first grade for calling a classmate the N-word, but he was Hispanic. As I grew up and acquired the strange sensation called empathy, or strange for boys anyway, I learned that for black folks, the flutter of that flag felt like a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And for the most prideful flag wavers, clearly that response was the point. I mean, come on, it's a battle flag. What that flag symbolizes for blacks is enough reason to take it down, but there's another reason that white Southerners should not fly it or sport it on our state-issued license plates, as some do here in North Carolina. The Confederacy and the slavery that spawned it was also a big con job on the Southern white working class. A con job funded by some of the antebellum one-percenters that continues today in a similar form. You don't have to be an economist to see that when you force blacks, a third of your workforce, to work without wages, that it drove wages down for everyone else. And not just in agriculture. A quarter of enslaved blacks worked in the construction, manufacturing, and lumbering trades, cutting wages even for skilled white workers. Thanks to the profitability of this no-wage and low-wage combination, a majority of the one-percenters of America lived in the South. Can I say that again? Right, huh? Where's our history professors here? The North had a lot of industry and plenty of rich people, but a majority, over half, of the one-percenters lived in the South. Slavery made Southern states the richest states in the country. The South was richer. The South alone, as a standalone country, had more wealth than any other country except England. They were wealthier than France or Spain. Yeah, right. Kind of mysterious, huh? But that vast wealth was invisible outside of the plantation ballrooms. With low wages and few schools, Southern whites suffered a much lower land ownership rate and a far lower literacy rate than Northern whites. Northern whites had a illiteracy rate of about 4%. In the South, it was about 20% of whites were illiterate. My ancestor, Cana Hyman, and his 2 sons did own land in North Carolina and fought under that flag. A note from our family history says, quote, someone came for them while they were plowing one day, meaning they were conscripted, drafted. They put their horses up, and all 3 went away to the war, and only one son, William, came back, and he was short one arm in that. Like Cana, most Southerners didn't own slaves, but they were persuaded to risk their lives and limbs for the right of a few to get rich as Croesus from slavery. For their sacrifices and their votes, they earned 2 things before and after the Civil War. First, they earned a very skinny slice of the immense Southern pie. And second, the thing that made those slim rations palatable then and now was the shallow satisfaction of knowing that blacks had no slice at all. They were bad off, but it was tolerable as long as somebody was worse off. So how did the plantation owners mislead so many Southern whites? They managed this con job partly with a propaganda technique that will be familiar to modern Americans, but hasn't received the coverage it deserves in our sesquicentennial celebrations. Starting in the 1840s, wealthy Southerners supported more than 30 regional pro-slavery magazines. They produced many pamphlets, newspapers, and novels that falsely touted slave ownership as having benefits that would, in today's lingo, trickle down. Trickle down to benefit non-slave owning whites and even blacks. If you say it like Hermann Goering, the propagandist for Hitler, he said, if you say a lie enough times, people believe it. It's a simple process. The flip side of the coin of this old is new trickle-down propaganda, the flip side is the mistaken notion that any gain by blacks comes at the expense of the white working class. That's how a lot of the white working class is manipulated. I think anything blacks get is going to come out of their pocket. And that was part of the story told then and now. Today's version of this con job no longer supports slavery, mostly, but still works in the South and thrives in the pro-trickle-down think tanks, the magazines, the newspapers, talk radio, and TV news shows such as the Cato Foundation, Reason Magazine, Rush Limbaugh, and Fox News. These sources are underwritten by pro-trickle-down one-percenters like the Koch brothers and Rupert Murdoch. For example, a map of states, if you looked at a map of states that did not expand Medicaid, which would mostly benefit poor whites. In raw numbers, it would help way more poor whites than it would help poor black folks. But it resembles a map of the old Confederacy with a few other rural states in other parts of the country thrown in. Another indication that this divisive propaganda works on Southern whites came in 2012. Romney and Obama are running. Across the country, they evenly split the white working class vote in the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast. But in the South, working class whites went 2-1 for Romney. Lowering that battle flag because of the harm done to blacks is the right thing to do, but we also need to lower it because it symbolizes material harm the ideology of the Confederacy did to the Southern whites that lasts even to today. One can love the South without flying the battle flag, but it won't help to get rid of an old symbol if we can't also rid ourselves of the self-destructive beliefs that go with it. Only by shedding those two will Southern whites finally catch up with the rest of the country in wages, health, and education.
Good.
Thank you. And so let me reiterate again, I didn't emphasize black folks, not because I don't care about that. I grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina, and that will mean something to some people here. But because the folks that were debating and that were fighting don't care about black people, but they do care about white people. And when they hear this message that has been lost, that's how we'll have fewer people voting for the Mitt Romneys and the Donald Trumps and things like that. But along those lines, this is a good point to mention Captain of the Planter. Who knows this book? Nobody? Okay. This book helped change my life. It was read to me by my 4th grade teacher, and no 4th grader ever had a crush on his 4th grade teacher like I did for Miss Haynes. I don't even know her first name. I haven't been able to look her up on Facebook or anything. But she was some young, beautiful hippie chick, fourth grade teacher, and she played the ukulele and would teach us to sing Bob Seger songs, 500 miles away from home. And this is in Beaufort, South Carolina, which had only recently integrated the schools. And she read us this book, Captain of the Planter, which takes place, the gentleman here, Robert Smalls, was from Beaufort, but he was living in Charleston because he'd been trained to pilot a steamer in that harbor. And so when the war started, he's like, oh, here's my chance. So he rounds up his family and his crew's families with a little plan where they are going to go down and take over the boat at night and steam down river, pick up their families on the shore, and then go out to the Union Navy and give him the boat. And of course, they made him the captain of the boat, and he goes on to help win the war and becomes a U.S. congressman representing South Carolina during Reconstruction. So a great leader, and the impact of the book on me wasn't quite apparent at that time, but looking back, what the value of it was that the story was so contrary to the history I was learning, which was all white folks doing, the Civil War. That's Robert E. Lee and Ulysses Grant duking it out, right? And the black folks are just like the chorus in the background. We don't really care about them. And so here's a black guy who's like taking his life and his family's life into his own hands and changing things and being a player. And so hearing this story in fourth grade kind of like opened my mind to the idea there's more going on than they're telling me. So it's a very subversive book in that sense. So I can highly recommend this as a powerful tool in the young adult realm. That's the big thing now. I've read it as an adult. I love it, but you can see it's kind of at a young adult level. But even fourth graders, we ate it with a spoon. So, okay, so now I'm going to address one of the things the Neo-Confederates say, that it wasn't about slavery. And my response is, ha, ha, you are crazy. Raise your hand if you've heard somebody make that argument that it wasn't about slavery, that it was about states' rights. It was about tariffs, taxes on imports. That's why all these Southern people are like, oh, we got to have a big old war because I'm tired of paying some taxes on things I import, And so I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm going to so each of the states that seceded, 11 southern states seceded, they either passed articles of secession or ordinance of secession, same thing. It's just they passed a law saying we are no longer part of the United States of America. Half of them, that's basically all that document says. We're no longer part of the USA. We're done. The other half pretty much say it's slavery. A couple of them mentioned some other complaints, like Texas is complaining, oh, bandits from Mexico are attacking us and the feds won't send troops. I don't think they would have seceded because of that. A couple other states said, oh, it's the fugitive slave law. When our slaves escape to the north, not all the northern states bring them back like they're supposed to. So they do mention some other things. A couple of them do mention the tariff, but they mention it in the sense of we need to secede because of slavery. And some of the other benefits are we won't be subject to these tariffs. But they don't make the case we're doing this for tariffs. They don't make the case we're doing this for states' rights, unless it's the right to have slaves. So I'm just going to read you quickly some paragraphs from some of those articles of secession. So this may be one of the most valuable tools if you're trying to work with some of these maybe people. And on the handout, it's the first site where it says websites. It's the first one listed, articles or ordinance of secession, full documents found here. So you will have that. You can put it on Facebook. Just go wild. So Mississippi. So what do the people in Mississippi say in 1861? Quote, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, meaning cotton, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolitionists or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin. Georgia. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave-holding Confederate states. By Confederate, they mean U.S., with reference to the subject of African slavery. South Carolina says, those free states assume the right of deciding upon propriety of our domestic institutions, meaning slavery, wink, wink, and have denied the rights of property established in 15 of the slave states and recognized by the Constitution. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery, heaven forbid. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to elloign or remove the property of enslaved Africans of the citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries, books, and pictures to servile insurrection. So this is why they're seceding. They're making it pretty plain. Texas, we hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. So how these Neo-Confederates read these and go, oh yeah, it was the tariffs. And I'm going to get to why I think that's happening, which I think will be very important. Last thing I want to read to you, and you may have heard of Alexander Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. And he made a speech that was tagged as the cornerstone speech. And in it, at the beginning, he does say, oh yeah, tariffs, we hate the tariffs, we hate these other things the the Yankees are doing to us. But it's clearly phrased in the sense that this isn't why we're seceding. These are some of the side benefits of seceding over slavery. So you may be on the fence about seceding over slavery, but we're gonna get rid of the tariffs for you, right? So he says, allow me to allude to one other thing. The new Constitution, meaning the Confederate Constitution, has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution. I mean, they can't even say what it is. African slavery as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and revolution. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea of equality. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. He doesn't rant about the moral truth of getting rid of tariffs or states' rights. It's all about slavery. So this is just, the discussion should be done, but go back to that group of three people. The no's will listen to you say this and come back with, well, what about the Corwin Amendment? Has anybody heard of the Corwin Amendment? So this was an amendment. So when the southern states started seceding, mostly it was the Gulf states, first seceded, the rest of the country is like, oh, we got to keep this from happening. We'll do anything. And so the Senate and the representatives passed a constitutional amendment by 2/3 majority that said that we're going to put it in the Constitution that nobody can stop slavery anywhere. Or nobody can stop slavery in the slave states. We still want to keep it out of the territories, which was a deal breaker for the South. They wanted it in the new territories. So you'll hear some of these people, oh, what about the Corwin Amendment? If the Civil War was really about slavery, here was the South's chance to get it written in the Constitution that they could have slavery. But they didn't accept that. So that's one of their arguments, that it wasn't about slavery because of this. But the South didn't want to go along with it because they wanted slavery in the territories. So anyway, but you can have a lot of fun just reading the Articles of Secession and sharing that with your friends, your Facebook friends who aren't so sure about this issue. Before I go on to the issue about the Solid South, I can take a couple quick questions. Yes?
But you're presuming that in presented facts that minds will change.
No.
What about willful ignorance, which is what was operating pre, during, post-Civil War,
Yeah, oh yeah.
including claiming that writings were changed.
Right. The question is that I'm assuming that people will be responsive to facts. And it goes back to the three groups I just described. One group will not be responsive to facts. Don't waste your time. Your time is precious. It's finite. I know there are young activists who seem to think they have infinite time and energy. They will find out. God bless them. Yes, right, yes. So yeah, there's some people, facts won't make any difference. Just go like, oh, I hear my mother's calling me home to dinner, I gotta go now. Just get out of there, respectfully. And then there's people in the middle who they may be touting some of this stuff, but if you're talking to them, you'll know if they're listening or not. Or there may be people who have heard this stuff, but they don't quite buy it, but they don't know what to say to their friends and family who are talking this, load of crap. And so those are the people. And if those people, those maybes, if they don't exist, then we're lost. We're done. Don't do politics anymore. Because it's always the people in the middle that decide how the election is going to go, whether the law is going to be passed, how the budget is going to go. It's always the people in the middle. So, yes, and you had a question. And then I'm going to go on.
And
yes?
I'm going to make it quick. I know, when I ask this question, I know slavery is morally reprehensible.
Yes.
However, I want to know why wasn't it politicians did not want it spread to the territories, and why did it end in the northern part of the country?
So she's recognizing that slavery was morally reprehensible, but wants to know why people didn't want it to extend into the territories and why the North didn't have it. Basically, most of the people in the North were a bunch of racists. But the economics of slavery didn't work as well there. So to the credit of the ones who were just against it for moral reasons, good on them. A lot of the people, it was convenient to be against it because it didn't make mathematical sense to have it, right? And so that was a big part of it. It was, on the one hand, you had people who were against it for moral reasons, and they were persuasive because they focused on the maybes. And then there were people who could see that, like, okay, I can't make money with slaves because the season is too short. I can't grow a high cash crop like cotton in the North, right? And so the economics of slavery worked in the South, did not work in the North. That's a gross simplification. We could have like a whole weekend of discussing all the nuts and bolts of it. As to the territories, the North was very much against the expansion of, once they'd come to realize, yes, slavery doesn't work here, and we now see it's convenient for us to see it as a bad thing, right? And I'm not saying they're bad people in the North. This is just how human nature works, right? Where we stand depends on where we sit. Who hasn't heard that? So the territories, the western states that were slowly becoming colonized, and as the Native Americans were moved along, and so the leaders in the North they hoped to slowly get rid of slavery. They knew they couldn't just pass a law saying no more slavery because the South hadn't enough votes to stop that. But they were hoping they could squeeze it off. They had outlawed the international slave trade, so you couldn't legally go to Africa and bring new slaves to the South. So they'd cut it off that way. They'd made it illegal in the North, and many of the states refused to support the Fugitive Slave Act. So if a enslaved African, a enslaved American was able to get to a northern state, a lot of people just would refuse to send them back. And the South hated that. And then the third part of this was by keeping the territories from becoming slave states. That was just another way to kind of slowly squeeze it down, recognizing we can't solve this today, but we can solve it in 10 years. And I know other people have questions, but we have other ground to cover, and I'll take some questions later. So that addresses their statement that it wasn't about slavery. If it wasn't about slavery, the Confederate leaders were kind of missing the boat or something, because that's all they talked about. So now what I want to talk about is this notion that most of us grew up with, that this solid South was bravely fighting the Union. There's a book called Bitterly Divided. The author's name is Williams. I don't have it on my list, but there's tons of books that cover this. He notes that on the Civil War's eve, nearly half of the South's personal income went to just over 1,000 families in the southern states. So their one percenters were much more effective than our one percenters. Let's give them that. So half of the South's personal income went to just over 1,000 families in those 11 states. The region's poorest half of the population held only 5% of its agricultural wealth. So I kind of just want to set the stage for you for how this civil war within the South came about. Now, how many people know that several states had a plebiscite, or a referendum is another word that you might be more familiar with, had referenda on whether to secede and voted it down? Who's ever heard that? Yeah, one person, two people. So North Carolina voted down secession in February of 1861. Tennessee voted it down. Georgia voted it down. But since 85% of the legislators in the South were slaveholders, what do you think happened? They said, okay, you voted down secession or having a convention about secession. We'll just meet as regular legislators and we'll vote to secede, and we're done, and we move on. There were 3 other slave states, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky, where the voters they voted against having a secession convention. So those were the border states, along with Missouri. So they were slave states that didn't leave the Union. Counties in Western Virginia voted against secession, even though the rest of the state voted for it. But they voted against it in the mountains of Virginia. Enough voted against it, they created a new state, West Virginia. The nearby Shenandoah counties also wanted to secede from Virginia. But because that was the breadbasket of the state, the Confederate armies went there right away to keep that part of the state from leaving Virginia. It's estimated that in other states, opposition to secession ran about 40%. And that's just among the voters. And so what defined a voter in those days? White, male, over 21. So 40% of them are against secession. White women couldn't vote. What do you think their, druthers would have been? 100% of African Americans couldn't vote. Where do you think they would have been on this, right? I'm just speculating. But I think if it had actually been universal suffrage, it's like they would have let's stay in the Union. We'll work it out. So, and to give you a sense of how influential slaves would have been if they'd had some way to vote or influence things, over half of the population of Mississippi and South Carolina were African American. Almost half of Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia were African American. North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and Arkansas were like quarter to 1/3 African American. So I think you can see how we can end up having a civil war within the South. In the border states, it was much less, like 10 or 13%. None of the northern states had slaves. There's a book called, pardon?
I've heard that there was slavery up north in New York State. That were not like people would have 1 or 2 or 3.
It was illegal. And people do, it's illegal to do lots of things, and people do them.
Oh, okay. But it was
So you may have heard of some family had a slave.
Yeah.
I'm not going to argue that point. It would have been illegal. All the
was
northern
it
states.
actually made illegal in the north?
I don't know, and it kind of doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me. There's a good book, South versus South, that really goes into the class issues in the South during that time. And the writer says, within 1 year of the outbreak of the war, so it starts in April of 1861, within a year, there were entire counties and areas of the South that had broken free of control by either the state or Confederate officials. Had broken free. As more deserters came home to hide, they banded together in self-defense and more areas slipped out of Confederate control. You didn't hear about that in class, no. By 1864, 2/3 of the people who had signed up for the Confederate Army were absent or without leave. 2/3 over the course of the war, 2/3 of the people who had signed up to join the Confederate States Army were gone, and I don't mean by that dead. So now here's another interesting thing. So do you hear much about people from the South joining the Union Army? Like 50,000 people in the Union Army were freed blacks from the North. Another 150,000 were runaway slaves from the South. 200,000 were Southern whites from the border states, from slave-owning states who joined the Union. Another 100,000 in the Union Army were Southern whites from Confederate states who'd made their way north. That's like 500,000 people. That's literally a quarter of the Union Army was Southerners, white and black. A quarter of the Union Army was Southerners, white and black. Approximately another 100,000, and this is just some wild estimates people have made because the documentation is slim, but approximately 100,000 Southern whites were in various militias in the South fighting the Confederacy. In North Carolina alone, there were 10,000 people active in the Red Strings. In the book State of Jones, the writers say when he had, Grant in the early part of the war was working his way down the Mississippi River and won a great victory at Vicksburg, 30,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered. They were surrounded, they were starving, they surrendered. 30,000. The Union leaders want Grant to keep them as prisoners up north. He says, no, I'm releasing them. I'm turning them loose on the South because they are fed up with the Confederacy and we don't need to spend time keeping these people alive. We'll just turn them loose in the South and they'll fight the Confederacy for us. He turned out to be right. Out of the 30,000 that he turned loose, only about 1,500 rejoined the Confederate Army. 5% rejoined the Confederate Army. 95% said, I am so out of here. And they went home. Further reports show in Mississippi there were at least 5,000 deserters, stragglers, and absentees, according to an inspecting officer for the Conscription Bureau. Men were leaving the rebel army faster than they were being rounded up, the officer noted with alarm. After losing in Corinth, Mississippi, so this is October 1862, a little over a year, 7,000 Confederate soldiers go AWOL, many returning to their home in areas in southeastern Mississippi, which is not far from where the Free State of Jones was. So it wasn't just in the field. Problems were in the cities. In that book, Bitterly Divided, I'm going to quote from that, the Confederate capital, Richmond, was so rife with anti-Confederates that it was one of the first cities to have martial law imposed on it. The Confederate capital, martial law. Its military governor was soon rounding up civilians he considered dangerous. They arrested so many Richmond civilians that the civilians alone took up the entire second floor of the military prison. In Richmond, an angry crowd of women became so numerous, numbering over 1,000. 1,000 angry, wives of Confederate soldiers, right? They became so numerous, so destructive, that the governor called out the local militia and threatened to shoot the women if they did not disperse. Often women would organize themselves into armed groups, ride up to a store, plunder what they could in a few minutes. In Lafayette, Alabama, the owner of a grist mill was struck this way, and he described the 14 women who plundered his flour as being armed with guns, pistols, knives, and tongues. He might even have said they persisted.
It's pronounced Lafayette. I'm from there.
Say it again.
I'm from Alabama. They call it Lafayette.
Lafayette, I stand corrected. Lafayette, Alabama. The women can be found with guns, knives, and tongues. The planters, the rich planters, the 1%ers, were encouraged to plant corn so the armies wouldn't starve, right? No, they planted cotton because that's where the money was. So they grew more cotton during the war than they had in previous years because the weather was good, partly. But they didn't because they didn't plant corn. So by 1862, 1 year into the war, not even like at the tail end, like at the beginning of the war, mobs of angry women were raiding stores, warehouses, and depots. This is from one of the other books. In Alabama, 40 women burned all the cotton in their path while scavenging for food. A food riot broke out in Richmond in 1863 when Jefferson Davis tried to calm the women. One threw a loaf of bread at him. So again, from 1862, April, so 1 year into the war, desertions from the Confederate Army began to soar, leading the Confederate Congress to pass the first conscription law in American history. Reflecting the South's class divide, there were exemptions for those who paid a fee or hired a substitute. The law also excluded anyone who owned 20 or more slaves. Partly because showing favor to those that owned a lot of slaves, but partly recognizing, wow, if we don't have enough white guys with guns on the plantations, the blacks will have a revolt and they will take over. So one of the things the Neo-Confederates also say is that, like, the blacks were happy being slaves. They were better taken care of than the white workers, which is just so contrary to any evidence from that period. But even then they tried to make the point that blacks were happy being slaves, but at the same time we really need to make sure we have patrols going around, keeping them from like getting out of hand. So it's like they had this two-faced vision of their own people. In November 1864, anti-Confederates, Unionists in the Virginia counties of Montgomery and Floyd formally declared the formation of the state of Southwest Virginia. Anybody ever heard of that? They declared a state. Anybody here from Virginia? Yeah. So you had, yeah. I lived in Virginia for 3 years in elementary school, and I was always into history. Never heard of that. My mother was a Civil War history buff. She was from Wisconsin. Had a bookcase full of Civil War books. Nothing about any of these things. Declared the state of Southwest Virginia and proceeded to elect a governor, a lieutenant governor, and a brigadier general of deserters. By the summer of 1863, there were an estimated 10,000 deserters and Unionists roaming the Alabama hill country. What I've learned from somebody from there is that the northern Alabama is called Tenbama because it's near Tennessee. So there were 10,000 deserters and Unionists roaming the Alabama hill country. Confederate authority over the area practically ceased to exist. And so I did learn at some point that, like, Western Piedmont, where the Quakers and Moravians were, they were pacifists, so they didn't support the Confederacy. But that was how it was taught to me. Oh, they didn't support it. They were pacifists, So I jumped ahead of myself a little bit there, but not just the Piedmont of North Carolina, but the coastal areas of North Carolina were strongly anti-Confederate. In the first half of 1862, the Unionist newspaper in New Bern faithfully and boldly reported that Unionists had organized militias in Washington, Tyrrell, Martin, Bertie, Hertford, Gates, Chowan, Perquimans, Pasquotank, and Camden counties on the coast. A North Carolina soldier named Godden writes to the governor of North Carolina, this is a quote from his letter. He says, "The government has made a distinction between the rich man who has something to fight for and the poor man who fights for what he will never have. Now, Governor, do tell me how we soldiers who fight for the rich man's Negro can support our families on $11 a month."
That's what they were paying?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Many historians like to point out that North Carolina contributed the most soldiers, true, and we suffered the most casualties of any state, 35,000 killed. But in the White Trash book, the author points out that North Carolina also had the highest rate of desertion. In Florida, a Confederate general, shocked at the extent of Unionist sentiment and anti-Confederate activity in Nassau, Duval, Clay, Putnam, St. Johns, and Volusia counties, almost the whole Atlantic coast from Cape Kennedy north to the Georgia line, wrote the governor and urged him to place those counties under martial law as a measure of absolute necessity, as they contain a nest of traitors and lawless Negroes. In Texas, Hispanic and Anglo anti-Confederates banded together to establish an exiles community in Matamoros just across the Rio Grande from Brownsville. In August, a group of families comprising 61 people left that area, left an area and started a trek to Matamoros. On the way, within one day's ride of their goal, these civilians were attacked by a pursuing unit of Confederate cavalrymen. 31 were murdered on the spot. Today, the True to the Union, the name of the monument, True to the Union Monument in Comfort, Texas, is the only monument to the Union on formerly Confederate soil and only the 6th mass grave burial site in the U.S. to fly the American flag at half-staff in perpetuity. Yeah. I'm gonna.
What's that town? You said
Matamoros, across
one in Texas with
Comfort. C-O-M-F-O-R-T is the town in Texas where that memorial is. So I actually have about 20 minutes more of stories like that, but we're down to the last half hour, so I'm gonna, cut that short and take like 2 questions. So yes, sir. And questions about like this solid South notion.
Yeah, I'm very interested in your opinion. Growing up in the North, there wasn't any. My heroes were. He was a little stupid. Pickett, George,
Yeah.
Robert E. Lee,
Yeah.
Stonewall Jackson,
Yes.
best military nickname of all time.
Yes.
Grant
True.
was silent.
Right.
I mean, William Sherman was considered evil, even up there.
Right.
And you mentioned textbooks in Wisconsin,
Yes.
same deal. Now, I was at a conference, James McPherson,
Yeah.
someone asked him that question. He said for the 100 years after the Civil War, right up through the 50s, just with all the history books written by Southerners.
Well, Texas controls most of the textbooks in America, the choices of
I was talking
right
about history
now.
books in general.
So-
He said, I can't think of a quote-unquote historian from the North who wrote a book about the Civil War.
Yeah, I can't address that. I don't know. But a lot of the references I found were from before World War II. So there were people writing about these things. So I'm just going to say, I don't think historians have an excuse not to be telling this story.
I never heard, 9 out of 10, I never heard
Yeah.
of it.
Question over here?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to have to ask, but what were the tariffs on?
Imported goods, and I don't know specifically which one. Nobody talks about those. But so for those who don't know, a tariff is simply a word for when your government puts a tax on imports. So these days, back in the days when Japanese cars were becoming a thing, we had a tax on Japanese cars to make them more expensive so that American-made cars would be cheaper because we wanted to support American workers, right? And so that's always a debate in every country. Do you tax these imports? And so in those days, the northern states had more industry, and so it benefited their workers to put taxes on manufactured goods from England. And the South didn't like it because they were the ones, they couldn't buy some local manufactured goods, so they would have to buy the English imported ones that would cost a lot more. That's as much as I know about that. I haven't looked into it much because I don't think it matters that much to this debate. And I'll take one more question.
I don't have a question, but I want to make a statement.
Please.
About the history books.
Yeah.
And when they were written. And I have this philosophy that we are in the predicament we are now as a country because true history has not been told.
True, I agree. That's the whole point of this. And in the back, I'm looking for a question. In the very back, yes.
So I would like to know which Native American tribes were allies with the Confederates?
I kind of don't want to address that except to quickly say there were some Native American tribes who had slaves, and that's become a thing now. And some of them allied themselves with the Confederacy even if they didn't have slaves because they thought it would give them more liberty than they had under the U.S. government. So that doesn't, and I'll take one question that is germane to what we've just been talking about, the Solid South.
You're right. Is there any evidence that, the argument that we have to protect our white women? That
Is there evidence?
came out after the Civil War, when the men left their white women to the care of black people and black men. So is there any evidence of gratitude or acknowledgement that families, including white women, were cared for?
Her question is there any evidence to support or contradict the notion that often put out that white women were at risk of being raped by black men if they weren't enslaved and kept constrained. And I don't have a specific answer for that. I'm sure there's always some anecdotal and perhaps factual evidence that probably some black guy raped a white woman at some point during
I'm not asking that.
But in the larger
Actually,
sense,
the evidence is
other.
that,
Yeah.
no, that white people were taken care of, white families were actually taken care of. But is there any evidence of white Southern families acknowledging being cared for?
I can't answer your question because I'm not concerned about that question. So I don't have an answer to that question, and it's not germane to the Solid South issue of dealing with the Neo-Confederates.
Solid South, because the narrative that you've been talking about, includes that
Basically,
slaves were happy.
The message for the non-slave owning whites was that your women were at risk if blacks are equal. A lot of the Neo-Confederates make the argument that, like, why would all these Southerners without slaves have fought the Union if they don't have slaves? Which sounds reasonable at first blush, but when you look into it and you find that constantly those magazines, newspapers, novels, all those things I mentioned in the essay were formulated to persuade working class whites that your women are at risk. That the Africans are wild animals, they need to be kept down. And you will have to fight the Yankees to keep them in their place. That was basically the message. And it's a load of crap, obviously. But like Goering said, if you say a lie enough times, people believe it, and they will act on it, and they will risk their lives. The point I'm making is that, like, not all of them bought it, right? Approaching half of the white men of the South were kind of like not buying into this whole story. Enough of them did buy into it to fill out the armies for long enough. And unfortunately, the leadership of the Confederate armies was just much superior. I mean, they were jerks and slave owners. But on the field, they were superior to most of the Yankee generals, and that's why the war lasted so long. If there'd been some equality of generalship, it'd have been over in like a year, really. Yeah, so what I want to talk about now in our last half hour is how to bring this into the modern times. And so, what's a good way to do this? Okay, I'm going to read you an essay that has been turned down by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, probably a few others. Not everybody can say their essay has been turned down by all those people. But this kind of brings it all together as to what we're dealing with, where some of our allied activists are focused on pulling down some monuments from the slavery era. And I'm thinking the real monuments that we need to pull down are the institutions that help sustain this tyranny of the minority that happened then, right? Yes. Where clearly if barely half the white men over 21 want to secede, but all the women and all the black folks can't vote, clearly it was a minority that wanted that secession, that wanted that war in the South, right? And so I think we're also suffering from a similar dynamic now, without the open warfare, without the slavery, but in political terms, some of the same thing. And I think reading this will help you see my point. Fists are flying and passions are swirling around the symbolism of hollow bronze statues to a treasonous Confederacy. Yet the largest and most dangerous slavery-era monument quietly resides in every state in America as it undermines our democracy. It's called the Electoral College. And we must tear it down. The founders crafted this, shall we say, peculiar bit of political architecture, hoping to preserve, in Abraham Lincoln's words, a house divided, half slave, half free. Like a soldier on a pedestal, the Electoral College stood on two legs, both of which skewed power in favor of slave states over free states, First, by counting enslaved non-voters, African Americans, even at a 40% discount, the 3/5 rule. So we're going to give you 40% off when we count your African slaves. First, by counting enslaved non-voters, slave states gained more U.S. House representatives and a like number of additional electors in the college. For example, in 1800, the free state of Pennsylvania, where slavery was illegal, they had 10% more free people, free persons, potential voters, 10% more free persons than the slave state of Virginia. But they also had 20% fewer electoral votes than Virginia. Yeah. Massachusetts Congressman Samuel Thatcher said the representation of slaves adds 13 members to this House, and in the present Congress, and 18 electors of president at the next election. That's a representation of slaves who don't get to vote. Clearly, it worked as intended. For 32 of our first 36 years, slave-owning Virginians held the presidency. Granted, slavery no longer applies, but it reveals the poisoned ground from which the strange and undemocratic Electoral College grew. Second, each state received a pair of electors to match its 2 U.S. senators. For those of you who don't recall how the Electoral College is set up, each state has however many representatives you have and how many senators you have, that's how many electors you get. And so, right. The way senators are allocated means that the roughly 500,000 people of Wyoming have almost 70 times as much representation in the U.S. Senate as nearly 40 million Californians. And I'll just make the point here that, yes, we have in our General Assembly, North Carolina General Assembly, we have House of Representatives, we have a Senate, but they're not set up the way the U.S. Senate is. We have equal representation in both of those bodies. So even though it's called a Senate, it's not, the U.S. Senate is set up so different than any state Senate. It is set up so differently than any other democratic society's House of Representatives. Likewise, these 2 votes per state in the Electoral College were meant to put the slave owners' heavy thumb on the scale of democracy in favor of the states with fewer voters. Right? So why does the Electoral College matter here? Because of this odd 18th century sleight of hand, twice in the last 5 elections, voters were denied their choice when the second place candidate became president. George Bush in 2000 and Donald Trump in 2016. Is it also merely a coincidence that they are considered by many to be the 2 worst presidents of modern times? And I remember arguing with colleagues, political colleagues in 2000, we need to do something about the Electoral College. And some of them, their answer was, Frank, this is like a once in a lifetime thing. We don't need to be worrying about the Electoral College. I can't tell you how many times I've had these experiences saying, we need to do this now. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it, Frank. It won't be a problem. So here we are again, right? 2 elections out of 5, the loser runs our country, right? So here's a part that may seem familiar to you from civics class. The conventional wisdom is that the founders fabricated the Electoral College not to protect slavery. No. None of it was about slavery. But they did it simply to protect the rights of voters in smaller states. That's what we learned in school, right? Sounds like a nice idea. Why doesn't everybody do this? Right? If that protection of small states is a universal democratic, small d, democratic value, why have none of the 50 states employed this practice in their elections for governor to protect the small counties? Right? Have you never wondered that? Why have none of the several dozen democratic nations on the planet used an electoral college to choose their chief executives? Nobody has this. Only we have this for president, so that the guy or the woman who comes in second can rule the country. And it stems from the structure of slave days, basically. Let me mention, I'm going to save that for later. It seems fair to ask if in their zeal to avoid a tyranny of the majority, the founders instead changed us to an institution that creates a tyranny of the minority. What can we do about it? The 12th Amendment is what created the Electoral College that built this anti-democratic monument to slaveholding. It can only be undone with a 2/3 vote of Congress and the endorsement of 38 of the 50 states, which is not happening this week. But a legal workaround and a quicker route to smashing this shameful monument is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Got that? Let me make a little digression here. Democrats do a stinking job on marketing. National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, the acronym isn't even any good, but the concept is very valuable. What it means is that as it stands now, so North Carolina, we vote for Trump, so Trump gets our Electoral College votes, even though Hillary won more votes. So if North Carolina joined this compact, if we had been in this compact in 2016, our Electoral College voters would have been told, you got to vote for Hillary. And every state that signs up with this compact would say, you got to vote for the one that won. Right? So 12 states have already done that. Together they have 165 electoral votes, but it's conditional. This compact only goes into effect when enough states with 270 votes, which is enough to elect a president, go into effect. I think that was like a dumb condition. They should have just said, just have your electors vote for the one that won. Right? But again, Democrats. So the compact is conditional on getting that. Another 12 states with 96 electoral votes have passed the compact and one or both of their legislative houses. So that's almost 270 are almost on board. If enough citizens on the left, right, and center want to ensure that our next president is the one with the most votes in 2020, who would be against that, right? Then we have to elect many pro-compact legislators, state legislators, in 2018. That's how we dismantle this thing that gets us such losers running our country. So only then can we dismantle the biggest, most dangerous monument from our slave-owning, anti-democratic past. Right? So the couple things I want to add to that. So the Electoral College creates this tyranny of the minority in terms of the president. The way the Senate is elected, where each state, no matter how big or small, gets 2 people, right? Right now, who has the majority in the Senate? Republicans. But did you know for the last several elections, 53% of the people have voted for Democratic senators who won. Democratic senators who won have been backed by 53% of the American public, and the Republicans, their senators are only backed by 47% because they come from smaller states. Does that not sound like wrong? 53% of people are voting for Democratic senators, but the Republicans have the majority in the Senate because of this 2 per state thing that no other country really does this. Other states don't do this with their Senate. Like each county gets 2, regardless how many people you have. Nobody does that. It was part of the slavery days. Third, House of Representatives. Some people may remember 2012, and Obama was leading, and we're thinking, oh, he'll have coattails, but the Democrats didn't capture the House, right? Like we thought he would, like we thought Democrats would. But more people voted for winning Democratic Congress people than voted for the Republicans. But they ended up with the majority in the House because of what? Gerrymandering. Which let me suggest, that's an 18th century word. Let's update it and call it jerry-rigging, which is really what they're doing. So the elections, and then this happened in North Carolina as well, where Democrats would have a bare majority of the votes, but the Republicans would get most of the House seats or get the General Assembly. So that's a tyranny of the minority. So in a lot of cases, and so the gerrymandering doesn't really come from slavery days, but the Senate set up an Electoral College does. And so, so if everybody wants to run out and tear down some monuments, my heart is with you, but I'm not going to join your party because this is where we need to be working. Because we can blow up all the Confederate monuments, and we still have who for president? We still have a Republican majority, even though there's a Democratic voting majority in this country, in for the House and for the House of Representatives, right? So how much time do we have left? Yeah, so the rest is for questions. Let me suggest, if you want to make comments or speeches, talk to Jenny, get a program. She will be happy to host you. If you have questions, right, because people came here to hear about this topic. So, yes, in the back.
My question is,
Yes.
just with regard to the last document that you read,
Pardon?
your last document.
My last essay?
the
Yes.
Did you get any feedback as to why they were not publishing it?
No, they don't give you any feedback.
Okay.
You got to figure that out on your own. I have a strategy. I have a plan. I always do. I'm never discouraged by setbacks. It's always just, when Jenny said I've mastered 9 professions, if I was discouraged by setbacks, would I have mastered the first one? No. When you have setbacks, that tells you you're learning something, right? And so I'm their loss. I'm going to figure something out. They'll run the next one. Yes?
I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, but maybe you do, that the whole reason for the whole Senate and Electoral College being, enshrined in the Constitution was that the slave states, even back then, were balking at
Yes.
being part of the original 13, and that was the compromise to be able to even have the United States to begin with.
True. She's asking that the original basis for the Electoral College and the way the Senate was set up was that the slave states then didn't want to join the other colonies to create the United States unless they could have this, and that's totally true. Yep, they had the other colonies, states over a barrel, and they played hardball and they won. Yep. So we're living with that. Yes.
What can we do other than a whole slew of phone calls that fall on deaf ears to affect appropriate redistricting as opposed to what they've been doing?
She's asking, what can we do aside from like phone calls that don't get returned to affect some redistricting? We got to throw some bums out in 2018.
But we can't do that until we get fair redistricting.
No, we have to do it before we get fair redistricting. And the way we do it, can we go back to like one of the first things I said? Who remembers one of the first things I said about persuading people? How many groups of people are there? Bing, there. They answered your question. Find the maybes. The people, because there's the certain yeses and the certain nos are not listening. They already have their mind made up for good or bad reasons. The people in the middle, and by the people in the middle, sometimes they're not voting, which I don't understand that. And I especially don't understand the people who say, oh, I didn't vote. I wasn't excited about the candidates. And I'm like, you're not picking a movie to go to. You are voting for somebody who's going to vote on stuff that like messes up your family or helps your family. It's really not more complicated than that. And I don't know why we're not more successful with that. Well, I think people don't use that message. This is you're putting your family on the line when you act like you're choosing a movie because you think the candidates all suck. It's like, okay, they all suck. I don't care. I'll vote for the worst Democrat on the planet. Because for a working person, I'm a working person. I have actual calluses on my hands. For a working person to vote for Republican is like a chicken voting for the butcher. You don't have to be an economist to, just look at the Great Recession. How did the Democrats, how did they not figure out why call it the Great Recession? Why not call it the Republican Recession? Because it took place after 2 solid terms of Republican president, Republican Congress. You can't blame the Democrats for that. And okay, maybe it's a coincidence. But then was the Great Depression also a coincidence? That took place after 3 terms of solid Republican president, solid Republican Congress. Go back further, 1907. The Panic of 1907. That was after 2 terms, solid Republican president, solid Republican Congress. And kind of more up to date, the S&L crisis, right? That was 2 terms of Reagan, and you'd say, oh, the Democrats had Congress, but it's like the Democrats were divided between liberal Democrats and conservative Democrats, and the conservative Democrats sided with the Republicans. So Reagan had a functional majority for a lot of conservative economic policies. So you don't have to be an economist to understand these things. I put a lot of the, blame isn't the word I want to use, a lot of the fault, maybe that's a better word, on journalists. Journalists. I've written for a lot of papers. I've been covered by a lot of papers. I have a lot of friends who write for papers, and they're all nice people, and they all work hard. Most of them can't do math and are afraid of numbers. There's a whole book written by a journalist about how one of the big problems in journalism, journalists can't do math. They don't understand economics. They shy away from economics. You know? But how hard was it to tell the story I just told you about, like, what preceded the Republican recession? What preceded the S&L crisis? What preceded the Great Depression? What preceded the Panic of 1907? These things don't happen after a decade of Democratic rule in Washington. They just never have. So, yeah, so get your journalist friends to kind of like tighten up, learn some basic math or something. We got to get better people in 2018 in the North Carolina Senate and the North Carolina House. And we can't use the redistricting thing as an excuse. The working people who've been voting for these Republicans, which a lot of the Republican platform, and I'm not against Republicans per se. My parents were both Republicans. They were good people. I have friends who are Republicans, and I respect them. But their economic analysis, just like with the Confederacy, is just like it's self-serving for some of the rich people. Because I'm not against all rich people. Some of them don't know, don't care, and they do nice things. But some of them have really bought into some of these analyses that aren't supported by the facts, aren't supported by history. That I mean, if tax cuts were going to supercharge our economy, I've been waiting 40 years. Right? Right, exactly. So working people have been buying a load of stuff the way the white working class did before the Civil War, because it was repeated over and over. And the folks in the South who were against slavery, or at least against secession, didn't do as good a job. Let's just be honest. Here's an important tool if you want to be successful in change and politics, is that when you take part in a campaign and you lose, as you sometimes will, and then you do your evaluation. Why did we lose? If the answer is, oh, the bad guys were bad, and they did bad things, and they had more money, that's why we lost. It's kind of like, okay, well, you'll just continue to lose. Your evaluation is never any good unless you go like, what should we have been doing better? Right? Instead of arguing with the no's, we should have been like meeting the maybes at a bar and talking to them in a respectful way. Instead of gratuitously beating up on them, you know, speaking truth to Facebook. Who's done that? I know a bunch of you have. Right? So the last thing I want to say is that these white working class Southerners, these are my people. These are my brothers and sisters. I don't agree with everything they say or do. But the goal, I've been doing politics for almost 40 years, and the goal I've set for myself now is somehow I have to get through to them. That's why these essays are written the way they're written. You know, I'm looking for the Southern white working class maybes who've been voting Republican sometimes. Some of them voted for Obama. Racist white people, some number of racist white people voted for Obama. Yeah. We need to just own that they will do that sometimes because there's different degrees of racism. Right? So when you're dealing with these maybes, they don't want to hear how smart and wonderful you are and how you've got it. What they want to hear is you starting off asking them questions. So heritage, what do you mean by heritage? What does that mean for you? That's a good place to start. And they will run around, you know, because like the people that love we love the South for all the same reasons people in the North love the North. Oh, the hunting and the fishing and the food and the family. There's not really much that's like unique about any given region. It's just we love it because we grew up there. That's why we love it, right? So a lot of these people are open to coming around to our way of thinking, but not if you're in their face about how wrong they are. Right? So compassion is the key. Who here was raised as a Christian? Yeah. Who's still a Christian? Okay, not so many. But the great message there and in other religions is about compassion and forgiveness. And if you're all up in somebody's face because you disagree with them, they're not going to come to you're pushing them into the no column. Really, that's what you're doing. And a lot of activists are really doing that right now. Maybe I shouldn't say this. Okay, I don't want to be a wet blanket, but I am really concerned that a lot of the activism, the way it's being practiced right now, is pushing too many maybes into the no column, and we should be winning let's call the abolitionist wing, should be winning in 2018. Yeah. we should be getting people who would say, yeah, this compact thing makes sense. We need to get rid of the Electoral College. We need to like unplug it. Yeah. But I think a lot of our activist friends who want to speak truth to Facebook and break things, and the anti-fascist people who think it's okay to punch somebody because they said something racist, you know, they are really, it's like 1968. You know, if you remember, the civil rights folks were very disciplined. They dressed well. They presented themselves well. They were nonviolent. They didn't let the bad people define how they were going to react. They're like, we're doing it this way. And that brought the maybes to their side. And then the anti-war movement came in and said, we're going to dress like dirty hippies, which I love and respect to all the dirty hippies. I'm a dirty hippie sometimes. But we're going to dress not like regular Americans, and we're going to get up in the face of all these regular Americans about how wrong they are. There's a bunch of fascists, right? And so the folks in that part of the movement take great pride even now how they brought down a president, meaning they made LBJ not run for re-election, you know, and they're proud of that. And I'm thinking, what? We traded LBJ for Richard Nixon? The law and order candidate. Because a lot of, you know, people on the abolitionist side, let's call it that, just like chased the maybes into the no column, and they voted for the law and order president. Do you see where I'm going with this? Yeah. It's easy to do things that make you feel good. I'm sure those people felt good pulling down that statue. I would have felt good if I'd have been there. But I wasn't going to go there because it's like, this feels good, but it's going backwards. This is risking the 2018 election so that you can feel good and have a great video. And not focus on unplugging the Electoral College, not focus on getting the redistricting in a nonpartisan fashion. It's hard because you got to go to boring meetings. And you got to listen to people you don't agree with. So, but that's where compassion comes in. A compassionate person can listen to people you disagree with and not feel like, oh, I'm offended, or I got to like get up all in your grill, or I'm going to unfriend you on Facebook. So if you've been unfriending people on Facebook, please stop. Come on. Because somebody says something you don't agree with or you think is like pretty bad isn't a reason to unfriend them or not recognize maybe they're still in the maybe column. And if somebody who don't put other people in charge of your emotional state, I don't understand the people who do that. Like, oh, you said something I don't like, now I'm all like in a frenzy. It's like, that's gratuitous. That's like a child would do, right? So I'm going to take two quick questions, one here and one there.
So you've been telling us what not to do.
Yes.
So I'd like to hear some about what to do and...
Join a political organization.
No, I don't mean broadly. I want to hear your answer on... I'm getting ready to go to Texas, and I know they're going to say to me, my family, my beloved...
Your loving family.
My beloved and loving family.
Who you haven't entirely unfriended on Facebook.
But I also keep my mouth shut a little.
Yeah, sure.
When I'm there. So I want to hear your answer to... Really, I want to hear what you would say to these people.
Oh, if you're to your own family?
Yeah, to the where they say, but taking down the statues is taking down history.
That's true.
So, but say.
I would say that's true. That's not the only thing that's happening, right? It's like was it Great Gatsby guy? F. Scott Fitzgerald. Was it him that said something along the lines of, you're not really an adult if you can't hold two opposing ideas in your head at one time without your head blowing up.
Saying it that way.
But we're talking about it here. I'm not talking...
I'm really asking you to say...
My point being that when they say it's history, you say, you're right.
That's right.
It's history, but it also is like what I said in the essay, it's like poking some people in the eye with a sharp stick. Is it worth that? I mean, that's how all things aren't equal. But I know you've met people who say, oh, on the one hand it's this, and on the other hand it's that, and I can't decide. And I'm like, one thing matters more than the other, right? And so they have decided, and so maybe they will acknowledge, yeah, I could see where Stonewall Jackson to a black person is like a poke in the eye with a sharp stick, but I still think history matters more. And then they're defining themselves in the no column. And that's when you let it go. I'm not saying we can help everybody or satisfy everybody or persuade everybody. That's like part of being an adult. It's like sometimes you just let it go. You want to enjoy your family.
Yeah, I agree with you. That point has been made.
Yeah. Yep. So, and you had a question. Yes.
I'm going to end with a compliment, and that is you have an extraordinary talent. And that talent is the kind of talent we see, excuse me if you pardon the name, Rush Limbaugh, or President Obama, or others. What are you doing, or what can you do to take this ability to speak and communicate using all the media that we have to start impacting the country in a new way, as Martin Luther King did, as Reverend Barber is doing? What can you personally do? Who's helping you get to...
Oh, I'm doing it on my own right now. I started doing politics in a time and place when biracial politics meant being the one white guy in a room full of black people in Beaufort. And sometimes I'd be talking to some of my mentors and colleagues and say, oh, what do you think I should be doing? They're like, Frank, you need to be talking to those white people. You know? And so that's always been in my mind, like, how will I do that? How, you know, what will I do? How will I do it? And then I moved to Durham, where you can have a great deal of impact on politics. I've got lots of colleagues and allies all through this audience, and we have done great things. We have made this a great town. We're a victim of our own success because we can't afford a house in it anymore. Our anti-marketing campaign of the 80s. But so the blue collar, if you go to the website that's at the top of the handout, Blue Collar Comeback, which is me, and because in doing op-eds for newspapers, they don't look very favorably on random guy has an opinion, no matter how well constructed. It's what they want is somebody with some standing of some kind. And so I decided, well, okay, I need a website where people can go to with my arms-long, lengthy list of, you know, political success that I've had in like changing things on the ground, and links to the essays that I've written, so they can say, oh, this guy's like, you know, been writing for a bunch of places, so, you know, we can run his stuff, and that has worked with some newspapers, not with this. And I think what this most recent essay about the Electoral College lacked was my personal angle. So Kana Hyman may make another appearance in that one, you know, fighting for the Confederacy and all that horrible stuff. But yeah, so I'm working on raising my profile in terms of getting op-eds out. I need to put up but none of these papers pay for op-eds, right? So if I was getting paid for them, I could crank out one every week. But if I'm not getting paid, then it's like one every, you know, 3 or 4 months I have time. Because those 2 essays I read you, that's like 8 or 10 drafts each. That's like big part of a week, right? To get it to that level where it's that effective and just works. And so I'm trying to put together a Patreon site. If anybody is like has an 11-year-old who can do, you know, stuff on the, you know, wake up their internet machine and make those things happen that I don't understand. You know, which a Patreon site would be a place where people could be your patron and say, oh, I'll give Frank $1 a month or $50 a year or whatever. And that way I have regular income so that I have the time then I can like, you know, there's my mortgage payment, boom. I can like sit down and get this essay right. So then, yeah, yes. Do we need to go or what can we do? Yes.
I just have to make this comment. This is not a question, but your last statement about what you're doing and you need, and I think you mentioned something about naming people. This is something that's been bothering me, and I email MSNBC, NBC, the names escape me, but all kinds of writers.
Yeah.
I always say, and I've said it until I'm blue in the face, we regular people need that forum that we can speak our mind and we don't need leaders to tell us what's right and what's wrong. We know, but we have to get our opinions and our feelings out there. And you cannot compete with the same old talking heads on TV that keep going over and over. God, I want to bust that TV screen so bad. We need to somehow communicate with people, and I guess we're just going to have to become disciples.
Yeah, I'm going to hand out a sign-out sheet right now. Yeah.
But we really do.
How about a plug for Durham for organizing? Yeah. Are any of you part of that? Yeah. Who are already doing canvassing?
Organizing.
Just talk to people, as you're suggesting. Talk to people. When we canvass, we just move on. If they're the no's, we just move on.
Good. You can vote
It
as during
means
canvassing
that
and
the
redistricting.
last Monday of the month at 6:45, it's a meeting at Russell Memorial CME on Alston Avenue. 6:45, the last Monday of the month. This month, there is going to be a mayor candidate forum, but
Where is it?
you should come present. If you want to do something practical, come on out to the meeting and sign up to canvass.
Where is it?
It is at Russell Memorial CME Church in Durham,
okay,
on Alston Avenue.
All right.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm gonna write it. Ride on Frank's coattails and mention what the Durham County Library is doing for education. In October, Durham Reads Together, our selection is the U.S. Constitution. We'll be giving them away for free starting on Constitution Day, September 17th. We have them in all languages to print out. We have some amazing programming and a wonderful website, durhamreadstogether.org. Tell your friends. Thank you so much.